Welcome to another Explainer. Today, we're unraveling what is honestly a fascinating detective story. But, not about a crime, it's about human evolution, specifically how our populations grow, stabilize, and eventually shrink. We're basing our entire journey today on a super comprehensive 1996 overview by Dudley Kirk called Demographic Transition Theory. It is literally one of the most documented generalizations in all of the social sciences. We're going to trace how this idea evolved from a fairly simple classification system into this really complex, multi-causal framework.
Okay, let's dive into this. To help map out all 13 of Kirk's original source headings in our search for causality, we're following this roadmap. Origins of the transition, testing the historical record, causes rooted in mortality and economics, causes tied to culture and history, institutions, policy and diffusion, and finally, the universality of transition. Starting off with Section 1, Origins of the Transition, covering the source headings, the forerunners, and the demographic transition theory. And this brilliantly illustrates Warren Thompson's 1929 typology, which was the first English formulation of the theory. He split the world into three distinct groups. First, you've got Group A. These populations are facing potential decline because their fertility rates are dropping fast. Then there's Group B. They're experiencing rapid growth, mostly because their death rates started falling a lot earlier and much faster than their birth rates. And finally, Group C, where frankly neither birth nor death rates are under any sort of control. Thompson actually classified that uncontrolled Group C as Malthusian. So what does that mean? Well, in a Malthusian state, a population inevitably increases whenever the means of subsistence increase. It's completely unchecked by any kind of conscious human control. And what's wild is that at the time, Thompson estimated a whopping 70 to 75% of the entire world was stuck in this highly vulnerable Group C. If we track the timeline here, we start with Thompson in 1929. But curiously enough, his work wasn't really picked up in the English literature for about 15 years. Meanwhile, over in France in 1934, a scholar named Adolphe Landry was actually developing the exact same basic ideas completely independently. But it wasn't until 1945 that Frank Notestein finally gave us the classic formulation of the theory that demographers still rely on today, officially tying the whole demographic transition to urban industrial society. I actually want to pause on Landry for just a second. His 1934 book was titled La Révolution Démographique. He coined that term to describe this massive demographic regime shift. And the guy was incredibly prophetic. He firmly believed this revolution had already conquered Europe and that, eventually it was going to completely take over the entire world. Landry also tried to tackle a really tough question. Why do people actually decide to restrict births? He kind of just brushed aside these older notions of moral corruption and instead described the motives as egotistical. Actually, scratch that. Egotistical sounds a bit harsh to us now, but for him it was a surprisingly modern take on personal cost and freedom. He was pointing to the literal financial cost of children, the loss of parents' relaxation and free time, and the physical toll it took on women. Section 2, Testing the Historical Record, covering the source headings, the historical record, and the European Fertility Project. So as the theory gained traction, scholars started looking backward to see if history actually backed the model up. And well, they found some pretty serious discrepancies. Early critics pointed out that pre-modern fertility varied widely. It absolutely was not a universal baseline. Also, mortality didn't always fall before fertility. Sometimes they dropped at the exact same time. But the biggest surprise? Fertility drops often clustered by language and cultural boundaries, rather than just neatly following economic modernization like they expected. To solve this mystery, Ainsley Cole organized the European Fertility Project. This was just a monumental 20-year study. They mapped vital rates across 600 different European administrative regions, from 1870 all the way to 1960, desperately trying to pinpoint the exact thresholds that trigger fertility decline. But the project immediately hit a roadblock with a concept called natural fertility. This refers to pre-transition reproduction levels that theoretically aren't subject to any conscious control. But the data showed that this natural fertility varied massively. We're talking anywhere from 5 to 8 children per woman. It forced everyone to completely rethink what they thought they knew about early family planning. Moving right along to Section 3, Causes, Mortality, and Economics, pulling from the headings The Search for Causality, Mortality, and The Search for Causality, Economic Theory. Okay, get ready for a truly staggering number, 574. based on a 1993 World Bank report cited by Kirk that was the peak disability life years lost per 1,000 population in sub-Saharan Africa. To really grasp what that means, we need to understand the disability life year, or DALY. It's a metric combining healthy life years lost to both premature mortality and disability. Just for perspective, established market economies lose about 17 years per 1,000 people. 17 versus 574. Kirk uses this to show exactly how disease and mortality act as this immense brake on human productivity and psychological well-being. But when mortality finally drops, thanks to hygiene and medicine, productivity skyrockets, and fatalism gets replaced by this powerful belief that humans can actually control their own destiny.
And that newly empowered worldview leads us straight into economics theory, specifically the Chicago School, and the concept of the rational actor. This is an economic model assuming humans make calculated, rational choices about family size based purely on costs, income, and tastes. Basically, the new home economics viewed having babies through strict cost-benefit lens. If kids cost more and provide less economic labor, the rational actor has fewer of them. Honestly, it's a cost-benefit analysis a lot of modern parents can probably relate to. Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds into culture and history, covering Caldwell's restatement, cultural and ideational theory, and historians' views. Because as you might guess, economics alone doesn't paint the whole picture. John Caldwell offered a really fascinating restatement of the theory. He contrasted strict economic modernization, which is all about structural and economic organization, against what he called westernization. Caldwell argued that you don't actually need a ton of economic wealth to trigger a fertility decline. You just need the ideas of progress and secularization to spread. So Caldwell defined this westernization as the adoption of Western ideas, things like mass education and the nuclear family structure. And under this shift, something massive happens. The wealth flow literally flips. In a traditional society, wealth flows upward from children to parents. But under westernization, wealth flows downward from parents to children. Suddenly, having a massive family becomes economically irrational. Other scholars jumped in to add to this cultural puzzle. Ron Lustig focused heavily on secularization and the rise of individualism, the idea that personal self-fulfillment was driving family sizes down. Meanwhile, historians brought in this whole new culture of reproduction, focusing on gender relations and conjugal power. They noted a crucial dynamic. Working-class women often wanted to limit births way earlier than men did, but they lacked the power to avoid what society deemed their wifely duties. It was really only when men's economic interests finally aligned with their wives' desires that a true demographic transition happened. Now for Section 5, Institutions, Policy, and Diffusion. Here, we hit the source headings on the role of government, diffusion, and the institutional background. The sources actually provide a very impartial comparison of government interventions here. On one hand, we see dramatic policy successes in places like China with its really aggressive state enforcement, as well as in Mexico and Colombia where the governments adopted wide-scale national family planning. But on the other hand, we see distinct policy failures. For example, early crash programs in Pakistan and Bangladesh faltered initially simply because the cultural and social conditions on the ground just weren't ripe for them yet. So, the crucial point is that government policy almost always requires diffusion to actually work. Diffusion is just the transmission of ideas. Yes, it happens through TV and radio, but more importantly, it happens through local gossip networks and everyday conversations with kin. It's basically the 20th century equivalent of an idea going viral. And over time, the demographic transition theory itself diffused. It evolved from a purely scientific inquiry into a major institutional policy tool used by global organizations to project the future and help manage world affairs. And finally, Section 6, the universality of transition, which takes us right into the source's conclusion. Dudley Kirk concludes that despite all these wildly differing variables, the demographic transition is becoming completely universal. Every country is on this continuum somewhere, which leaves us with a truly provocative question. If populations are moving towards a post-transition era of demographic homeostasis, meaning a brand new equilibrium of low births and low deaths, what happens next? As children become scarcer and our global population ages, which, we're already seeing in today's headlines about places like Japan and Europe, what happens when humanity eventually faces universal population decline? It's a profound thought to end on, and a perfect reminder of why understanding this transition is absolutely crucial for our future. Thanks for exploring the data with us today.